If you've ever taken a traditional ethics course, especially in philosophy, you know there are lots of ways you might reason through an ethical problem. Previously, we offered you one, reflexive principlism, that we think is particularly suited to the engineer. We want to try, in this short piece, to give you some reason to think that it is, in fact, the best fit among some standard alternatives. So let me offer you a couple of examples to build this case. First, you might in fact count up negative and positive consequences for a particular action. You might calculate them, reason them out, write them on a piece of paper in 2 columns, negative and positive, and pick the one that works the best, the one that has the best outcome and the least negative outcomes for all stakeholders involved. While that's a very oversimplified picture, that's the basis of an approach to ethical theory known as consequentialism, or reasoning by consequences. Such consequentialist reasoning can be powerful, but it has significant limitations. For instance, imagine a case, any case, where you're trying to do exactly as I described. Write down all the positive and negative things in 2 columns. This calculus, so to speak, is endless. You are obligated to take into account every possibility for all stakeholders that could potentially be involved, a process that would take each of us the entire rest of our lifetimes. We'd never make any decisions whatsoever. It also leads to particularly interesting cases that philosophers love to discuss with their students. For instance, if you're a consequentialist, a strict consequentialist, you might think, look, there's a crime problem in the United States. Here's one way to solve it. Let's take an innocent person. We don't care if he or she has done anything wrong. We put them on national television, and we torture them. And the message we'll convey to the viewing public is, this is what will happen when anyone breaks a law in this country. And let's assume, hypothetically, that this works, and that after that nobody commits crimes or that the crime rate goes asymptotically to 0. That one person has served a purpose. Torturing him or her was the outcome that led to the best overall consequences. Surely not the best consequences for the person we tortured, but overall for the best consequences. But that's strongly counterintuitive. Nobody thinks that's a good idea, and yet it seems to follow from consequentialist reasoning. If limitations like that turn you off from a story about consequences, you could always tell a story about rights and duties. You might think, for example, that we all have a duty not to lie. Lying is, in and of itself, by itself, a moral bad that we should all avoid. This story is not about the relative merit of actions based on their consequences, but of the rightness and wrongness of the actions themselves. These types of approaches, called deontological from the Greek meaning deon for duty and logia, logic, offer a classical alternative to consequentialism. We see this come up as an example in our talk of human dignity, something you hear regularly in the popular media. But deontological ethics has its own set of issues, namely source and justification. So what makes a particular rule a good one? Is it God, or nature, or reason, or the will, or virtue? How do you explain those? It's problems like those that make justifying which rule you think is a good rule very difficult. There are also extreme cases here as well, famously. There's an example from Immanuel Kant called The Murderer at the Door. Briefly, that story goes something like this. There's a knock at your door. You open your door and there's a murderer there. The murderer says, "Is your roommate home? I'm going to kill her." Assume you know your roommate is home and you know the murderer is going to kill her, so you could do one of 2 things at this point. You have 2 choices. You could either lie and save your roommate's life, or you could not lie and the murderer will kill your roommate. Now, in the basic reading of the deontological view that Immanuel Kant espouses, you should never lie. Lying is a moral bad independent of its consequences, and so you have a moral duty not to lie. And this seems like a counterintuitive case again. There are problems with scope on the deontological account also. How do you account for non-rational humans, so-called marginal cases? How do you account for non-humans in general? These 2 ways of reasoning morally, the consequentialist way and the deontological way, are mirrored in our civic policy in the United States. There are notions of greater good that are always weighed against individual freedom, and never without issue. So personal autonomy and greater good seem to be at odds. And so there's always a seeking out of a pragmatic approach, basically like the way we treat scientific theories. We settle on a hypothesis that we take as true until we find evidence to the contrary. It's in this way that reflexive principlism stands as a third path. It's a pragmatic path that attempts to avoid the limitations of the classical models I told you about by leaving space for the ongoing deliberation and reflection in context. There are problems here too, of course. How do we prioritize among the four principles? How do we define them in context? But the answer, we think, is reflectivity in community, an idea that should readily appeal to the engineer, who is already attuned to the ongoing processes of design and problem solving.